I found the neighborhood segregation project to be very interesting. I was fascinated by the many things I learned about my own community that I wasn't aware of before. The first thing that really caught significance for me throughout the paper and project was looking at things through a sociological lens. Due to the vast changes the U.S. faces as we move into the 21st century, we find that this is vital. It's very important to look through that lens in order to more accurately understand people and societies. It was interesting because I chose Gary, Indiana, a well-populated urban area, versus my own hometown, Madison, Indiana, a more rural country setting town. Gary is populated with 1,551 people per square mile, compared to Madison at 107. Quite the significant difference. Now granted, in Madison, there is a lot of grass and minimal concrete, versus Gary, a very small area that's more concentrated, is full of concrete, more city of course. It was pretty, I assumed this much as far as being more highly populated, that there was a higher concentration of crime, and so it was no surprise to find that Gary has a significantly higher crime rate, even above the state average, versus Madison, who is considered below the state average and has a lower crime rate. Now with that being said, the population of Gary is primarily African American, with a pretty small portion of the rest of the population being a mix between Hispanic and white, whereas Madison is primarily white, with a smaller portion of African American and Hispanic, and very minimal Asian. It was interesting to learn the history of these towns, where a steel mill brought people into Gary, and that's how the city formed. It was industrialized, and it brought in a lot of employment. And as we saw a decline in the industrialization area, we saw a lot of the white class leaving and going to cities such as Chicago nearby, and a lot of the population then became, primarily African American. Versus Madison's history, which the Ohio River, brings in a lot of its significance and history with transport and bringing in goods. And there is a significant pride that to this day has taken place for historical preservation, which is a very significant part of my neighborhood. The history, while everyone else was modernizing their cities and trying to update them, Madison was continuing to try to preserve the history. And to this day, we have historical societies that continue to strive for that. I thought it was interesting when questioned towards the end of our project the significant symbol of our neighborhood, and I realized as I was more observant and walked around and tried to take in what's significant about my town, and it's pretty hospitable, but I would say the one thing I recognized was the obligatory notion of greeting everyone that passes by, whether it's as simple as hello, or more commonly, hello, how are you, regardless of the true interest in how one is doing. It is very common for someone to go further than just hello, but also to ask how they are. I feel that in conclusion to this, as I've looked into all of the details that I studied, and I've pretty well thought this for a significant part of my life, that I have strong feelings towards a lot of the significance of how our neighborhood impacts us is related to how populated the area in which we live is. Living in a city versus living in a rural, suburban, inner city versus suburban, and then again, rural versus country, versus more isolated. I believe that is one of the biggest impacts of a neighborhood, on one's upbringing, and reflecting back on life, on what has influenced them. I do feel strongly, and this is completely opinionated, it is only my personal opinion, but I feel that oftentimes the more populated the area, the more diluted the people. And I think that this has a lot to do with the intimacy of relationships and the accountability that that brings. With accountability, I think there's less crime rates, and with intimate relationships, there's more accountability to, watching out for other people and taking care of and having pride in one's own property. So I learned a lot through this through this project and this paper, and I mostly now realize more about my own personal community, and I appreciate it even more. And so that's kind of the significance that I gained from this neighborhood segregation project.